Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another show of Kaam Ki Baat. This special series is being held on behalf of the Awaken India movement. And this series is about the genetically modified crops or GM crops as they are known. The reason for holding this particular series right now is because the government of India has allowed for the commercial release, the open field trials of GM mustard, genetically modified mustard. So we have been talking about various aspects of GM crops and how they affect as to what is their problem for the agriculture, who is behind this, what is happening in the legal matters, and then what is going to happen to our animals and to our livestock. Because, a major portion, and to our bees, a major portion of what happens with the genetically modified crops and due to the cross pollination and the genetic pollution, what could be the impact on our animals, the livestock, because animals are a major aspect of Indian agriculture, Indian farming. And so today we have with us our guest, Dr. Sagari Ramdas from Hyderabad. Welcome, Dr. Sagari. Please join us. Thank you for joining us today. And friends, let me tell you, Dr. Sagari has enormous experience in the field of animal health. She has done her veterinary science degree from University of Haryana, and then she has been to the University of California to study animal breeding and genetics. And so she is absolutely the right person to talk to us today. And not only that, she has been working with and on the aspects of animal health in a special area, that is the Adivasi regions of East Godavari and Adilabad in Andhra Pradesh, the then Andhra Pradesh, which is the United Andhra Pradesh. And also even now, she has been working extensively with animal breeders in Medak district. And so and not only that, she has trained a lot of women at the grassroots on veterinary science to be their own veterinarians at the grassroots. So welcome once again, Dr. Sagari. Thank you for coming here. Dr. Sagari, can you please switch on your mic?
Yeah, it's on, and it's wonderful to be here, Saraswati. Thank you for inviting me to this really, I think, it's very important show that you're doing.
Yeah, so without wasting any more time, let's get down to the first foremost issue. Dr. Sagri, you have worked extensively in the Adivasi regions, which are the hotbed of biodiversity. I know we are talking about animal health, but before we go to that, let's also ask about what is happening, what happened, because, I remember my introduction to GM crops happened because of that first meeting which you held in 2002 with respect to the BT cotton, right? When BT cotton came in, what happened in the Adivasi areas? How were the farmers? Because Adivasi areas, we all know that how it was a biodiversity zone, and what happened post BT cotton. Can you just tell us what was the impact?
Thanks, Saraswati. And so we go back actually nearly 20 years. That's the time period we're referring to. And I was in the East Godavari Adivasi regions, and that was a period where through the 90s up to the early 2000s, the ITDA at that time had introduced tobacco as the first commercial crop. And this was through a tie-up between the ITDA, which is the Integrated Tribal Development Agency, and at that time the ITC, which was the India Tobacco Company. And through a lot of heavy kind of support and investment which the ITC made through the government, it got Adivasis into cultivation of a very special kind of tobacco called the burley tobacco, meant entirely for exports. Now, having got into this, of course, as long as the international markets and global markets were fine, they'd made some kinds of marginal profits. But then, as will in all these kinds of globally connected markets, there was a massive collapse in the markets. Adivasis fell into huge debt. And that was just roughly around the time when, of course, at one level, our work was organizing Adivasis to go back to growing their own food crops. But the government then came in and that was a moment where, of course, GMO cotton hit the commercial space for the first time. This was, if I'm not mistaken, this was 2002, 2003. And the cotton was literally, BT cotton was at that moment just introduced into Adivasi areas, essentially promising them that, look, this is going to lift you out of your indebtedness, which you've landed up into because of the tobacco. Number two, you're going to have to use absolutely no pesticides because this is, it's a pesticide resistant kind of cotton which you'll be growing. And of course, there was no information, the free and prior informed consent clause, which now operates internationally in the sphere of biodiversity and is particularly for indigenous people globally. All of this happened much, much later on, right? We're talking about FPIC comes in only around 2010, 2011. But this is a situation where in the early 2000s, and there is no information at all. It's the one-sided narrative which the government gives as to the fact that you're going to be lifted out of debt, the fact that this is a pesticide-resistant variety, which of course subsequently all of us know it's only really the Bt toxin is directed only towards one kind of pest. And so so the fact is that so you introduce new technology without providing the entire sets of information through which indigenous people can make their own, importantly, free and prior informed consent. So there is no question of consent. It is just dumping into a very new, very, very biodiverse space, a new technology. And this is not a technology, once it's out in the environment, it's out there, right? And so one of the consequent kind of impacts that, of course, on the livestock, fortunately in Adivasi areas, given the kind of access to forests and that most of these regions are forested regions, animals are grazed primarily in the forests and didn't then need to be grazed on a cotton residual crop. And that's the second part of the story that we will be discussing today. However, the impacts, particularly on bees, has been devastating. And when you look, for instance, in the Nalamala region, and it's very, very sad that in the Nalamala, this is one of the most, dense forests, biodiverse forests. This is a region now being declared a national park. You want Adivasis to be pushed out of there, but you want to keep it for tigers. However, this is a region now where in the peripheries of wherever Adivasis are living is also where a lot of non-Adivasi, non-tribes are also living and they are cultivating. And again, the whole kind of invasion of Bt cotton as a primary crop which is grown there. This has had terrible kind of impact on disappearance of bees, and bees there are numerous kinds of bees in the Nalamala region. For instance, I'm just giving you an example. So now when bees, this is an indicator, right? It's an environmental indicator because the bee is not just a bee for honey. The bee is one of your, what should I say, one of the most key,
pollinators.
Exactly, it's a pollinator. It also reflects the health of the entire system. So when your bees start disappearing, and this has directly been linked into with the advance of the advance in terms of geographic area capture by Bt cotton, year upon year upon year, it's very much had the kind of impact on I would say, the very crucial diversity of these regions. So yeah, this has been the story. And of course, I think that, I don't know, maybe your subsequent questions, we can then move further.
I have a question right now here. When we are talking about the biodiversity, I would also like to ask you, was there any impact on the flora, not just the fauna? Because we're talking the flora,
on the flora, right?
Because we are talking about hotbeds of biodiversity. That's where India's biodiversity is
So
still
the very of deep concern, let me say, which of course, and the thing with Bt cotton is that this is such a gradual, it's a whole process which is unfolding, right? It's an unfolding process which you see then what's happening year upon year upon year. So as I think one of the things is that and I wouldn't just put it to the technology of Bt cotton, but the the system of production, industrial system of production, which is highly capitalized. So it's a capitalized, capital intensive system of cropping, which has now become the mainframe or the mainstream of how cropping is happening even in Adivasi areas, is that when you get into debt, the logic of debt is that to get out of debt, you want to invest more. So then you start expanding your areas where you will then grow more cotton. So it is this cyclic process of debt leading to more the push to get out of debt means that you feel you have to then lease in more land or put more of your own land under cotton, hoping that at some moment you're going to break even or get out of this debt. So I would say that this is the real worrying factor, that with a capitalized system of industrial agriculture, which is now really the mainstream, the main kind of driving force of how agriculture, the commodity agriculture, which you see almost even in Adivasi areas. I mean, today in Adilabad or in East Godavari, I would say now the cotton cultivation has come down quite substantially. But if you look at Adilabad, if you look at the Nalamala regions in Telangana, if you look at some of the regions in Khammam, you still have cotton. And it's this debt cycle which then advances the capture of more land, putting it under cotton. So I would say that's how then the rest of the diversity gets impacted. And more so nowadays, because there's this, since the last 2 years, now I would say 2 to 3 years, there's been this huge explosion of use of herbicides, right? I mean, glyphosate and herbicides are having, so it's again, because industrial cultivation means that you are trying to constantly displace labor, mechanize. So this entire system pushes you into utilizing all kinds of practices, which essentially are really harming the diversity which exists. Yeah.
So, you also mentioned to me that the HTBT cotton, which is actually not officially allowed, but that is also being promoted or just being sold, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is that it has no legal sanction, right? And so here is where, when you have non-existence and very limited, I mean, you've had a whole process of 20 years of liberalization. One of the key areas of liberalization was really cut back on your entire system of your public agriculture space, where you will have extension people, you will have agriculture officers, you will have agriculture, the entire kind of the mechanism of being able to be there to monitor what's happening, to be able to respond to when there are reports that HT cotton is actually spreading. So of course none of that is there. You may have a GO, you may have any kind of government order basically saying, and about 2-3 years, every year, the Telangana government, many other governments have said that glyphosate is illegal, glyphosate should not be sold commercially. But of course, I know that
No,
currently,
but
even if you compare last year to this year, the cultivation of HT cotton has expanded pretty much from, say, 10% maybe a year ago, or 2 or 3 years ago, to nearly between 20 to 30% now.
no, but
Yeah.
HDBT cotton didn't have the legal sanction, right?
No,
Did not
that's
have
it.
the
It doesn't have
GST
it. That's
permission.
what I'm saying. That
So how did
HTBT
it come
cotton.
inside?
Exactly. So that's the question, right? How has this been? How has it come? How are you being able to buy the seeds? Everybody knows that they call it, in fact, it's called glyphosis. They call it glycis cotton. They call it
Oh.
glycis nakli cotton. Okay, that's how it's referred to. But the glycis nakli cotton is happily being able to be bought. It is being sold. And then, very dangerous is the fact that it's brought in the entire extensive and intensive, and from year on year, you're seeing this the use of the glyphosate as a
Yeah.
herbicide. Now it's killing everything. Not only is it killing everything what comes in its area, it's also resulting in, and I've observed this, that it's resulting in very many certain kinds of weeds which are seem to be having acquired some kind of resistance and have just gone. It's almost as if, you know, when we used to read about how in Australia they had these super weeds. And I
Yeah.
really think that these super weeds have started exploding in some of our regions in Telangana. Not only in Telangana, I've seen it in Andhra, I've seen it in parts of Maharashtra. But the problem is that where are we actually, where is the system which is the government system, which is monitoring, which is responding to these, which is investigating into the unfolding ecological and the ecological and environmental changes which are occurring, you know.
The
And
impacts. Yeah.
yeah, and it's impacting all of this. I mean, we spoke about the bees. We're speaking about, I'm seeing super weeds. It's very, very clear. It's devastating how even the shepherds, and maybe when we talk about the impacts on the sheep, we can talk about that. But
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
very clear observations they are making, saying that we are not going to graze our sheep on, even if they have to compare between HT, the illegal HT BT cotton and the regular BT cotton, they are choosing not to graze their sheep at all on the HT cotton
Yeah,
because they
we'll come
say,
to that.
yeah,
We'll
yeah,
come to that
okay,
later.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
now the most important question is, see, when the BT cotton was brought in, they said that because this is resistant to the bollworm, the bollworm, the bollworm, that was what the cotton was known as,
Yeah.
bollworm one and two and three. So has it reduced? The farmers were told that you won't have to spray the pesticides, right? It was basically pest resistant. So has there been any reduction in the pesticides use?
Not at all. Not at all. Because it's very, you know, all the studies, all the experiential experiences of farmers is very clearly indicative of the fact that it's not just the bollworm which is the one pest, right? There are multiple pests which are attacking the BT cotton, and therefore, at least, I mean, in my view, they are spraying between 3 to 4 times in a cycle, and pretty much now, what would it be? Nearly 100% of the cotton which is grown is all BT cotton or GMO cotton. I would say there's probably a
Right.
1%, right? There's like some rare 1% which are organic,
Non-GMO.
non-BT cotton or non-GMO cotton. So the fact is that when you have this scenario, you're in a sea of BT, you're in a sea of GMO cotton, and yet they are having to spray. Even all your figures showing the utilization and the use of pesticides and how it's increasing year upon year upon year is just indicative of the fact that
Yeah.
BT has not actually addressed the problem of pesticides. Yeah.
Pesticides at all. So now we come to the main subject is what happened post BT cotton for the grazers, because you essentially worked both with cattle rearing communities and also the sheep rearing communities. So
Yeah.
we know that in Telangana, a lot of grazing lands are disappearing. So farmers are, or normally in their own farms, they grow, or rather they graze in their own farms, right? In
Right.
most of the cropland. So can you
Yeah.
tell me what happened with what has been the impact of BT cotton? Because that's the only GM crop for
Yeah.
which we have experience. So
Right.
because we have to learn from our experiences.
Yeah.
So what happened with the BT
So,
cotton on
yeah.
livestock?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to trace this nearly now 20. Yeah, it is a 20-year history, right? Because the first year when the GMO cotton was was commercially grown, I think in Warangal district in Telangana, it was 2002, 2003, and the first year where we began to, and when I say we, at that time I was the director, one of the two directors in Anthra, an organization which I helped found. This was in 95. And as a group which was specialized in looking at issues to do with animal health, anything to do with really animal health, animal production, you name it, our whole sphere of work was to do with livestock and animals. So we got, I think it was the season of January 2005. So that must have been the third year of cultivation. So if 0203 was year one, 0304 was year two, 0405 was the third year of BT cotton cultivation, we were contacted because there were reports from Warangal that there were this massive, unusual mortality and morbidity. So when I use the word morbidity, it is essentially certain kinds of symptoms without death, but also there were reports of death of sheep which were grazed on cotton after the harvest of the boll. So, now the cotton harvest season is on, and it'll be, most of it will kind of wind up by around end of December. So shepherds really turn their sheep into graze, and particularly, as you rightly mentioned, in states like Telangana, where grazing land is becoming more limited year upon year, then you use whatever grazing avenues you get to graze your sheep. So one of those are cotton crops or cotton standing crops. So the shepherds let their sheep into graze around, say, December, mid-December, end December, and they continue grazing through January, February. And so what happens is that the cotton is also then producing new leaves, right? So we began to get these reports, and we, through 2005 to 2009, we were closely following and closely tracking what's going on with sheep in terms of the mortality, in terms of the morbidity. And essentially what we found was that it was not that. So, the first year there were this reports of 18, something like 1,800. Even today, if you Google, you'll find, oh my God, 1,800 animals die. Our own assessment was there was a lot of what we call confounding factors, meaning that there were other diseases which also occurred at that time, and it was very difficult to separate out what was a response, or let's say a response to grazing on the BT cotton, and what would have been what would have really triggered this 1,800 strong sheep, numbers or population of sheep which died. However, the fact remained, and this is very clear because we were tracking and following several flocks of sheep, not merely in Warangal, but this was in primarily Medak district, in Warangal district. These were the two districts where we were closely following and tracking the animals. And, as an NGO, your capacity or your outreach is also highly limited by your own, by who your human resources are and where your community base is, etc. So we were very clear by the time it was around 2009, there were some very common symptoms which we could clearly, narrow down to it being either an allergic response or a direct response to what appeared to be to the BT toxin. And this included immediately as the sheep started grazing on BT cotton leaves, it was cough, it was cold, it was all kinds of respiratory distress. There was no fever though, right? And in some cases, and particularly when we were tracking, we found animals which were repeatedly exposed to the BT appeared to have more severe and intense symptoms than first-time grazers. So then we found there were cases of either death, and death would be preceded by intense pneumonia. In some cases, it was diarrhea or bloody diarrhea. So, of course, what we then did was, and it was not just Anthra, but there were other NGOs at that time who also took the initiative. One of them was CSA at that moment. That was the Center of Sustainable Agriculture. And so we basically enabled and ensured that shepherds took their dead sheep and made the nearest veterinary hospital conduct a post-mortem, carry out a post-mortem examination, and then send those samples to either national or state laboratories for further investigation. Now, the thing is that what happened was in 2006, the samples were sent to both state and national laboratories. In 2007, they were sent to state laboratories alone. In 2008, they were again sent to the Indian Veterinary Research Institute, which is one of the premier institutes for investigating disease and all, in the country. And in 2009, again, they were sent to the IVAR. Now, interestingly, in every year, the same samples which were sent to diverse laboratories came back with different kinds of results. All right. So this was one very clear thing, that there was no consistent
Mechanism.
consistent kind of result as to what is the cause of death. Also, what was sent, and this we got through RTI, which was filed, was they sent samples of plant, and there was a lot of confusion here because we don't know, was it the same sample of plant which was sent to all the laboratories? Was the animal tissue the same animal tissue sample sent to both the state laboratory or the national laboratory? But very significantly, and but the responses, and I'm not going to go into the details. I mean, we have, this is all out there in public domain. I can share the link of our paper, which very, very meticulously documents, what the kinds of response, what were the kinds of the divergent kind of results which came in. But very significantly, this was in 2008, when we sent in samples to the IVRI rather, and very specifically asked them to test for Bt toxin, right? And this was done by Anthra. And we sent the sample to IVRI saying, look, this is the case history, we suspect this cause of death, and all these samples were sent. IVRI came back to us saying, look, we cannot test for Bt toxin because we don't have any capacity or ability to test for the Bt toxin.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So of course, then subsequently, all this accumulated kind of information, we were able to then submit to the GIAC, which was, of course, the Genetic Engineering and
Approval
regulatory
committee.
body and approval committee. And the thing is that in 2007, the GIAC till then had no mechanism for no protocol in place for testing the impact of animals grazing on a BT cotton or a crop, because their entire testing protocol went on the assumption that animals were not going to be grazed on these. But suddenly now you're seeing that from the field, animals are being grazed, right? So in 2007, building on all this data, and I
have to interrupt you here.
Yeah.
Okay, they didn't have the mechanism to test because they didn't assume that animals are going to be grazing.
Right.
But did you find if they had any kind of mechanism to check if the impact on other crops, or even the biosafety mechanisms that they are supposed to have before the introduction of the BT cotton on the crops and on human health?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that the protocols, and I think Dr. Bhargava at that time did extensive work on this. He, in fact, said that for foolproof kind of investigation and testing before it will be released commercially, or before it can even reach the stage of field trials, he set up that there were some 20 different tests which still needed to be done, right, which were not part of the protocol. So the existing protocols itself of testing were completely limited, right? They did not look, for instance, on the impacts of animals. They didn't look, for instance, on the impacts of on human beings who are busy. And there were reports, again, in the early 2000s about how human beings who are plucking, and these were young children in particular, right? There was a lot of incidents of child labor in harvesting of cotton. And so how children were being impacted by allergic reactions on their hands, on their fingers, so none of these, or on the environmental impacts, like because you're talking about, this is not just a mechanical technology, it's a living organism. Yeah. So what was going to be the biodiversity impacts? And none of these form part of that protocol. So the thing is that when all of this information, and one of the aspects which is very significant, when shepherds kept going to the government and to the departments and saying, look, our animals are suffering like this, the only response from the veterinary doctors was, stop grazing your animals on the cotton fields. The treatment which they were given were completely treatment linked, which were treatment you usually give for cases of toxicity, cases of poisoning. right? And actually, if I'm not mistaken, this was around 2008 or 2009. Government, that time it was government of Andhra Pradesh, they sent out a geo saying, actually telling farmers, do not graze your sheep or your cattle on BT cotton fields. All right. So this was the kind of information already going out from the state without having any capacity to really investigate further into what was the interaction between animals and the BT toxin. So in 2007, the GIAC actually took a decision that leaf toxicity studies will form part of their protocol, which in our view was a very positive step, because at least then that would demand that you do some kinds of tests of seeing what is the kind of toxic reactions or responses. But then, interestingly, in 2008, they reversed their decision, barely 6 months later. All right, barely 6 months later, they reversed this decision. And the reason for their reversal of this decision was they said they had received evidence that the death of sheep or the morbidity of sheep was not to do with BT cotton at all. And they mentioned that they had received this evidence from the IVAR and from the Department of Animal Husbandry, Andhra Pradesh. So, of course, we weren't going to keep silent. So, of course, from Anthra at that time, we filed an RTI. We filed the RTI to the IVRI saying, look, please give us your evidence, okay? We demand that you share with us what studies have you done, what kinds of feeding studies have you done, and what have you submitted to the GIAC? Now, basically, the IVRI came back to us saying, we have done no studies. We have submitted nothing to the GIAC, and we don't know what you're talking about. So, of course, then we went back to the GIAC and we filed an RTI to the GIAC saying, look, this is what we have received. We want we would like you to share with us what is this evidence. And you know what the evidence was? The evidence was basically I think there were 4 letters. One letter from the Department of Animal Husbandry, Andhra Pradesh, basically pulling out all the different kinds of data which we had already been mentioned, all this divergent data about how they sent one sample to one laboratory, got one set of answers, samples to another laboratory, getting another set of answers. But bottom line was, I must say, to the credit of the Department of Animal Husbandry, they actually said that we need further biosafety studies. All right, that was their very clear pointer in their.
This was said by who? By who?
By the Department of Animal Husbandry at that time.
In Andhra
Pradesh, yeah.
So, now, I just want to interrupt here.
Yeah.
I mean, to make a comment. That is, on the one hand, the Department of Animal Husbandry actually says that the biosafety studies have to be done. They are asking the farmers not to graze their on the BT cotton, and yet the GIAC just says, okay, we have the evidence, it's not
yes,
impacting.
We have the evidence. Okay. Then the IVRI, the evidence which GIAC sent us was that the IVRI has a letter from the IVRI to the GIAC saying that we are doing a BT cotton feeding study on goats. And then the third evidence was from what the GIAC then sent us was that they said that they sent us company data. Okay, so Mexico was the one who actually the government outsourced the testing. Now this is of course amazing, right? That the company you are using company data to make your decision about the safety of that crop.
So the company that was manufacturing
so the company manufacturing the seeds is the one who then GIAC sends us this information, said, look, according to Mexico's data and studies, the toxic, the what do they call it? The acceptable toxic levels of BT protein in leaf, or they didn't mention in what, but whereas we then further went back to ask them, look, are you talking to us in leaf or in animals, right? But they basically said that the acceptable BT toxin level in leaves is between 5 ppm to 10 ppm. And therefore, when they tested whatever BT toxin levels in the leaf, they said that it is well within the acceptable levels. All right. Now, the interesting thing is that anyway, the bottom line was that the GIAC, and then of course we went back to IVRI saying that, look, you guys first told us that you've done no studies. Now the GIAC is showing us that you've done a study. So what's going on here? But we got no reply, essentially. And then finally, the point being that, so what the GIAC did was they said, and look at the circular evidence, the circular reasoning which they used and were trying to pass off as evidence. So first you say that the non-testing, you don't have the ability to test, so you don't test. Then you say that because there's no testing, of course, you don't have any results, right? You've tested for everything else. So what you then do is you say that the presence, and some of those tests, for instance, show there was presence of nitrate or presence of nitrite or presence of selenium or presence of another form of heavy mineral deposit, either in the leaf or in the animal's tissues. So then they say that because there's the presence of nitrate or the presence of nitrite, the cause of death was nitrate and nitrite, and the cause of death had nothing to do with Bt toxin. So the point we made, and we continue to make, and I continue to make, is look at the circular reasoning which you're using as evidence. Non-testing, ability not to test means you don't test. Non-testing means you have no proof of, you don't know, there's nothing to show whether it is Bt toxin or not. So the absence of any kind of testing shows there's no result. Because there's no result, that is then passed off as the evidence, right? So you don't have the capacity to test. You do not test. You don't get a result. And no result means that this is the evidence. And furthermore, whether the presence or the absence of nitrate or nitrite does not prove that that is the cause of death in the animal, right?
Right.
And so this has been the two. So one is fraud and deception. Yeah. Because none of this will pass off in any international arena of testing and what is it, your mechanisms of biosafety protocols. None of these meet those standards. Yeah. And then you're passing it off as the non-detection is a proof of safety, right? So, and so of course it went on in this vein. There were further tests done by both the Venkateshwara Veterinary University here in Andhra Pradesh, as also the Center for Sheep, the Center for Sheep Research Study Institute who also did studies. And in both cases, right, there was data there which clearly shows there was something to be worried about. So in the case of the Venkateshwara university study, there were high levels of heavy metals like lead in the presence of in the hepatocellular system, in the liver. There was all kinds of heavy metal residues higher than the permitted levels.
How is it related to the Bt toxin?
So we don't know. But the fact is, when you fed your animals on Bt cotton, right? And this was the group of animals fed on Bt cotton. So they did a study feeding animals on Bt cotton and non-Bt cotton. And then they compared both. And then they basically compared both, and they found that the levels of heavy metals were much higher in the deposits in the various tissues of the Bt cotton of animals fed on the Bt cotton as compared to animals fed on the non-Bt cotton. Now, the point is here that when you have such data, it requires further investigation, right?
But they have not done that.
They've not done that. Now, from the CSWRI, similarly, and the other thing was there was like a higher level of, there's something called liver AST, where you basically, it indicates that there's liver damage, right? And now when post-mortem has been done in many of the cases, when we also did post-mortem and sent samples, there was damage to livers, there were damage to kidneys, there were damage to the intestines. Okay, the intestine part. So the point is that, and then in 2008, when CSWRI came out with their study, it showed that the lambs fed on Bt cotton were much heavier then the lambs fed on non-BT cotton, and they actually said, "Oh, this is such wonderful news that that animals are much heavier." But for me as a scientist, it's like, no, that's something to be investigated, right? Because we don't even know what is the kind of interactions happening there in terms of impact on
Yeah.
weight gain. Is it hormonal changes? Is it some kind of unnecessary weight gain which you're getting, right?
So,
And
yeah,
all this evidence, Saraswati, just last one point, is we use this to actually, when the BT Brinjal case was going on, we used all this evidence to make our case in front of the public hearing on BT Brinjal. And I
yeah.
think that this was a very impactful way in which one of the reasons why the moratorium on the release of BT Brinjal, we were able to really contribute to that with this kind of work that we did.
I
Yeah,
need to
so
ask you a few more questions.
yes,
I
please
know
do,
because
please do.
we have
Yeah,
so
yeah,
much information
yeah,
because
yeah,
we are also talking to common, normal people like me who
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know much science. So now in this context, right? So we know that there has even till date, as if I'm not mistaken, there is no system of ensuring biosafety with reference to BT cotton, which has been here for 20 years,
Yeah.
right? And then while you're talking about all this damage that happened to the animals, which means all these animals, a whole lot of them which did not die perhaps, but maybe sick, they were eaten by people because goat meat and mutton is very very popular in Telangana especially. The people must have been eating that, and what could have happened possibly for their health? This is one thought. What was must have been happening in the last 20 years, right? So it is not just about the animals dying, but if you're looking at cattle, people must have been drinking that milk. And if you are looking at sheep and goats, people must have been eating that meat, without the knowledge of what is happening. So in this context, and not only that, BT cotton was used for the cottonseed oil. So all of us have been consuming that. So are you aware of any impact on the human health because of that?
See, so this is where again I would say that it the absence of any method or mechanism for really tracking what's going on, right?
Yeah,
Because human health can be impacted today by so many factors. So
true.
to be able to really make this is the cause and this is the effect, it's, I would say, extremely difficult.
Difficult, right?
However, I think I would like to take us back at this moment back to the animal health point factor. The thing is that the questions we raise, and they continue to hold good till today, is that what exactly is looking at the interaction of BT toxin on animals. Um, is BT toxin a stress factor to animals? Is it resulting in an allergic response, right? And we know, for instance, today if we think of countries like the US, where allergens and people with allergies is just so widespread, right? I mean,
Yes.
allergics and all, it really is. I mean, even if you look at the
And
relative
they're
kind of.
eating a lot of GM food, actually.
Exactly. And that because you don't have any kind of labeling rules in the US, there is no way to really monitor. The one thing we do know is that relatively the amount of allergens which you're finding, food reactions, allergic reactions, is so much higher. So for us here, the question is, when I come back to animals, and the symptoms I described continue till date. Okay, every
Yeah.
year the sheep continue to be affected by as soon as they enter the cotton fields. As soon as they enter the cotton fields and they start grazing on these leaves, they start having this cough and cold and some of them fall
Allergic
really
reaction.
sick and allergic reaction. So is it an allergic reaction, for
Are you
instance?
still seeing any deaths? Are you still seeing any
So
deaths?
again, the question on deaths. Yes, you are seeing deaths, but is this death a direct trigger because of a stress factor, or is the stress itself reducing the immunity of the animal and making more susceptible to other diseases during this season? For instance, during this season, we do have PPR, which is another very, very highly prevalent contagious disease among sheep. During this season, many sheep are prone to pneumonia. And one of the causative bacteria is Pasteurella hemolytica, for instance. So the fact is that, and this is the question which really a scientific or evidence-based, science-driven kind of let's say government veterinary system would
Should
really
be.
then follow through, that you would further investigate these questions. Is it directly Bt toxin? Is it Bt toxin as an allergic factor? Is it a stress factor which is reducing immunity? Is it some kind of change in the actual mineral content? Because you've been seeing these changes. I mean, every time you've tested Bt cotton, you've seen mineral changes in the plant itself. So, is there a
Yeah.
mineral change going on? I mean, what on earth is really going on? Because the
Okay.
absence,
I
and
need to.
I would say that
Yeah.
this is where the absence of any effort to really to monitor, to investigate, to track, to then further go back and see to fine tune your own protocols, right? No, the risk assessment is nil. Your post release factor of it's your responsibility. It's you are accountable as the government of having, because you've released these GMOs, to actually track these impacts. And
But
so
no tracking.
there have been no chronic or long term studies done. There have been no allergenic testing protocols done. There have been no intergenerational studies. Now, 20 years you've had BT cotton. Till date today, the sheep are still suffering. NGOs, I was with Anthra till 2015. I moved out subsequently. But what is your capacity? What is the kind of funding you have? What is the kind of resources you have? Whereas the government system and the government mechanism, every panchayat or nearly every panchayat has a hospital,
Right.
has a veterinary hospital. So you have a system which could be really pulled together, geared up to be able to do this kind of close monitoring, close tracking. Particularly when you have, at least till today, you have just one legally permitted
Okay.
GMO.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I need to interrupt because we are having a lot of other things to talk about. So that
Okay.
I think has made a lot of things clear. First of all, despite having GMO for the last 20 years, there is no mechanism for testing, for biosafety mechanisms is not there. And then we managed to stop the BT brinjal because of that. So at this juncture, as a doctor, of course, you have been associated with the animal health, but now they're bringing in something called the GM mustard. They have
Yeah.
already allowed for the open field trials. So, is this like opening a Pandora's box? What do you say? What do you
Oh
think?
yeah, in my view, totally right.
Yeah.
Um, I
So,
didn't
what would you?
mention that. I didn't mention that in Haryana. So, like in the use of cottonseed cake, as far as my understanding is, in Telangana, for instance, is quite minimal as far as feeding your animals. But the use of cottonseed cake to feed your animals, especially your milch animals, in Haryana and Punjab and many other northern Indian states, is very, very, very common. So one of the reports which we were getting from Haryana was that feeding milch cattle with cottonseed cake was resulting in a fall in milk production. It was resulting in all kinds of reproductive diseases, abortions. Again,
For the
this
animals, you
inability,
mean? For
yeah,
the animals.
on milch cattle. And one of the things which is very one of the studies which was done in France, and of course the name of the scientist is now a very famous scientist, and the name is, of course, with my gray hair just not dropping into my head at this moment. But there were studies which were done on rats, on toxicity studies on rats and intergenerational studies in rats, which actually showed how reproductive capacity of rats was affected by continuous feeding of Bt toxin. For instance, I'm just giving you an example, how there was deformed rat babies, which were born when rats were continuously fed on Bt toxin. Now, the thing which I'm highlighting here is that so you've not done these studies, and yet your animals are being fed on cottonseed cake in Haryana, in Punjab. We don't know, which other, in many, as I said, northern Indian states. Now, this is not been investigated at all. The BT cotton and sheep story has not been investigated at all. And now you're talking about mustard seed, GM mustard. GM mustard is one of, mustard is one of the most, what should I say, one of the most widely grown rabi crops, right, across the northern India belt. Also here in parts of Telangana, Karnataka, as part of your rabi crop season, you have a mixed cropping where one of those crops is mustard seed. Now, if you're going to have GMO mustard, and of course mustard oil is so widely consumed, mustard seed cake, mustard oil. So you're now talking about GM mustard entering our food chain without having completely investigated a non-food crop which was already having which has been insufficiently studied, investigated, interrogated to establish what is this interaction going on between animals and BT toxin. And now you're proposing to actually commercially release GM mustard. I mean, I would really say that you are embarking upon such a dangerous path, right? Because it's so convenient. And my worry is, and this is what I want to flag, is your absence of investigation and your capacity, your inability to investigate, your inability to test, your inability to actually establish what is this connection. It's so easy then and convenient for you to say, no, it has nothing to do with GM mustard. This is to do with something else. Because that's been the experience with animals, right? That's been the experience with sheep. If sheep today are still suffering from cold and cough and morbidity, and therefore, morbidity, what is morbidity?
But you also mentioned the reproductive issues with
and the
the milk.
reproductive issues in animals amongst large the dairy
Larger
cattle,
animals.
large dairy cattle in
And that could actually mean a bigger problem,
of
because
course
if the
it could.
problem is, if I understand right, if the problem is intensifying in the bigger mammals, that means the problem could be much greater in humans, right?
I mean, these are all in the realm of. This is why I'm saying, for me, I really go with the fact that when you do not have the capacity to do this really thorough and comprehensive investigation and monitoring and analysis, and have actually worked out your protocols and made this available not just in one lab in the country, but because you're talking about a widespread crop, it has to be in every panchayat, that capacity. Your basic protocols need to be in place. So I am saying that something very importantly, that when you do not have this capacity, I can't assume, I have no basis of even being able to tell you with authority that it is BT toxin. I can't, because I don't have, all I can do is I'm showing you, giving you all the information, the evidence that there is something going on here which needs to be investigated further. There's a huge lot of experiential based what should I say? The experience and the data from the field is showing, and the experience of shepherds who at the end of the day are the ones who are suffering and who have to bear the loss. They are the ones who are bringing in there, even as far as, even till last year, even this year, shepherds go with those sick animals to, in fact, the only thing they are continuing to be told by the Department of Animal Husbandry, the veterinarians, is don't graze your animals in those crops. They
But
are
they're
telling the
asking
shepherds.
us.
Oh yeah, they're
They're asking.
continuing. So I may have stepped out of. As I said, myself, I stepped out of the entire the very minute, detailed tracking, because for how long can you as a civil society organization continue doing this? But shepherds are not stopped going to approaching the one institution which is accountable to them, which is the government veterinary system. And the veterinarians are telling them, don't graze the only thing we can tell you is don't graze your animals in the cotton fields. Okay,
So,
now
Dr.
when you're telling the shepherd, don't graze your animal in the cotton field, what does that mean? It could very well be the BT toxin. It could be some other factor. But why are you refusing? 20 years have gone by. You've not not even put in the mechanisms to do this kind of testing, to do this kind of investigation. And therefore,
Correct.
yes, my fear is that when you don't have that capacity, you have no authority to be actually saying, yes, we will release this new GMO food crop now out into the commercial market, because
Right.
therefore you then need to bring in the moratorium
One
onto this,
second,
right?
Dr. Sagri, I just want to
Yeah.
ask our viewers if anyone has any questions. I have not seen many questions here, otherwise I would have interrupted you in between. So
Okay.
this has been a very informative discussion, because a whole lot of people out there need to start thinking. All of us have to start thinking. When the animal husbandry is telling people don't graze your animals on BT cotton, yet they're telling us it is absolutely safe for you to eat
GMO.
A
Yes.
GM mustard, a
Yeah.
HT mustard on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't know what are the consequences going to be.
Exactly.
So, what would you advise to the people of India, to a lot of
So
our
I mean,
brothers?
I would say that what's extremely important, whether it's as citizens of India, is that we need to really be able to organize ourselves to be able to voice our protest and our resistance in terms of actually flagging these concerns, right? Flagging these questions. And
Right.
I think that somewhere perhaps that is an area where the citizenship and the response that we have. I think one of our rights and one of our responsibilities as citizens is to really raise these questions and raise these concerns and ask those very. I mean, we don't even have a public hearing like we did for BT Brinjal, for God's sake,
Right.
right? At least, I mean, we
We
had
had
these.
one at that.
Pardon?
We had it for the BT Brinjal,
That's
yes.
what I'm saying. We had it for the BT Brinjal. We had a proper, thorough public hearing. And that public hearing gave us the space to come in to raise these questions. Whereas we don't have those public spaces, those democratic spaces for us to raise our voices any longer. And that, I think, is something that we need to really be demanding for. The second aspect is animal health elements in the GMO question have to continue to play center stage, because if you don't have the mechanism for your animals, you certainly don't have it for your human beings at this moment. And so, yeah, I would really say it's about our citizenship, our citizenship responsibilities to question and to
I have
demand. Yeah.
I have a very crucial question. I want to ask one last question, because we are almost there for
Right.
finishing of my time. Sagri, you're so right in raising this concern and demanding further investigation before allowing in this GM mustard. That is one of our Gurveen Kaur. I think she must be from Punjab. So, what I want to ask is, what is pushing? See, we don't have these mechanisms. I know you had also flagged off very briefly. Can you talk about what are these things that are pushing for these crops in
Can
India?
can you
Like,
repeat your question, Saraswati? I
yeah,
lost you for a minute.
the international pressure on India to introduce these GMOs into our country. I
Right.
remember there was something called the Knowledge Initiative Act
Oh,
enacted
right, right.
when George Bush was here in Hyderabad
Yeah.
under Babu Naidu's time, and a whole lot of things. Can you throw a little bit of light on that? I mean, maybe take a few minutes. Like, I know we're 5 to 10 minutes.
I mean, I would say definitely there has always been this very hypocritical track taken by, whether it was Europe versus so Switzerland. I remember, and continues. Switzerland has this complete moratorium on GMOs, but the Swiss had no problems in pushing GMOs and promoting GMOs in the global South, all in the name of addressing our so-called food security requirements. And as we know, that's such a false argument which is made. So I think the fact today that India is so closely depending upon international trade and all these it's like I pat your back and you pat my back. So we want to have access to new markets for selling our make in India products. And so in turn you have to open out your markets for from technologies to products, etc., to services, to etc., etc. So I would really say is that today, in today's kind of trade scenario, the kind of area that we have placed ourselves. We are now going to be taking over the presidency of India's taking over the presidency of the G20 group. All our pronouncements in terms of trade are all to do with we really need this international access to markets. And so I think that trade is a very major factor which is informing and shaping the kinds of decisions we are making around the questions of food. Now, you link it to, millets are not being really, the fact of millets is because they're wanting to push it as this superfood internationally. So it's not about really looking at the food which is good for every single citizen from that uh, that tiniest, remotest village where there are people today who are being forced to are still in the debt trap of of growing BT cotton and then buying the most pesticide intensive food. I mean, our interests in this country are no longer about safe food, good food, which every citizen in this country can eat. But I think for me, it's very clear how trade is playing a very strong role in informing what we are doing on our farms and what we're doing, therefore, what the consequences for the food we eat. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sagri. I don't think I think our people are all very dumbfounded after listening to you. So thanks a lot, Dr. Sagri, for joining us today. And I'm sure this particular interview is going to open up a lot of people, a lot of questions, because in our country, when we don't have, what would you suggest we all do? Green cow. Okay, there is one question. What should we
Yeah.
do?
Uh,
I think, okay, you want to answer that?
I mean, I think I said that just a little moment ago, so I don't want to repeat myself. I think as citizens, how do we really use that citizenship to be able to
Yeah.
demand at least certain basic steps of the democratic process of being able to, as I
And this
said,
is
for
about
me,
our
a very
food.
specific
It
one.
is,
Pardon?
yeah, and this is about our food, the very
Oh
basic,
yeah, it is about our food, and what are we
and the
going to be
basic right
eating?
to our
Mm-hmm.
food, for food,
Yeah, I mean,
and safe food.
I'm so scared that I on the little bit of land that I'm learning to be an agroecological farmer. We always during the Rabi season we grow the mustard seeds, and that's the seeds we keep saving year on year. And I'm petrified now that if what are we going to do? So I think I think as food consumers, what exactly are we eating? And that is because all of us are a food consumer. And I think that
Yes.
that's where it begins.
Yeah.
That's where it has to begin. Yeah.
So, Gurveen ji, one thing I can definitely say that Awaken India movement has been working. We've worked extensively regarding the vaccine mandates, which were again, uh, curbing of our democratic rights against the constitution, because the constitution has given us the right to safe food, safe health, and the right over our bodies. And if they are forcing us to eat GM food also, it is against the Article 21, which gives you a right to refuse anything that could be against, that could be detrimental to your health. So do join us, our team of activists across India. You can look up our various groups which are there on www.awakenindia.com, and the link is posted here. So let's all come together, because that is the reason why we are finding that increasingly all the democratic spaces are being shut down for us. So it is high time that we all join together and reclaim that space to bring in true democracy. So thanks again, Dr. Sabri, for a very informative uh, discussion, very in-depth discussion that we've had. So thanks a lot, everyone. Jai Hind, and let's join for yet another show on this GM Crops later.
Thank you, Saraswati, for having me here. Yeah.